So factoring quadratics is when you're factoring something, you're trying to find what multiplies to be that item. So what multiplies to be quadratics is two binomials, and it's basically the opposite of FOIL. So if you remember FOIL, you have to distribute the x first, and that's your first. X times x is x squared. This would become negative 2x, negative 6x, and this becomes positive 12. And then you would combine your two middle terms, and that becomes x squared minus 8x plus 12. And so what factoring is, it's going the opposite way. I'm given this quadratic, and I need to figure out what two binomials or what two items multiply to be that quadratic. So first we're going to go over the easy ones, and that's when a is a 1. So you can use these easy steps only if a is equal to 1. So here I have a quadratic, x squared minus 9x plus 20, and to factor it, because the a is a 1, I can use these easy steps. Again, make sure you're only using these steps if a is equal to 1. A lot of people will try to do it all the time, and it doesn't always work. It only works when a is equal to 1. I make a big point about that. So find the two numbers that multiply to be c and combine to be b. So what multiplies to be 20 and combine to be negative 9. You may sometimes need to list all the factors of c, in this case 20. And I have 1 and 20, 2 and 10, 3 doesn't go into it, 4 and 5. And then once you're next to each other or the same number, that's all the factors. And which of these add up to 9? Well, these add up to 21 or combine. These add up to 12, and these combine to be 9. Well, that's close, and this is where the sign comes in. So if the c is positive, you need your factors to be the same sign, and you're combining them or adding the numbers to get that b term, to where if that c is a negative, you would have one positive and one negative to multiply to be that negative, and they would subtract to be that b term. And because they combine to be negative 9, what that means is that both of these terms are negative. Negative 4 times negative 5 still multiplies to be positive 20, and they combine to be negative 9, which is correct. And then you put them in the parentheses. So it's x minus 4 times x minus 5. And again, that's the easy way. You find the two numbers, put them in the parentheses, you're done. So we're going to do one more. And in this one, 4x squared plus 20x minus 24. Make sure that if the a is not equal to 1, that you always check for a GCF first. And that GCF, remember, is greatest common factor. A lot of times you can factor out a GCF and then the a is equal to 1, and you make it a lot easier on yourself if you always check for the GCF first. Get in the habit of always checking for that GCF. So here, what goes into 4, 20, and 24 is going to be 4. So you're going to factor out that GCF. And factoring out the GCF is basically the opposite of distributing. So if I factor out a GCF from this first term, now that's just x squared. If I factor out a 4 from this 20, that's just going to become 5x. And factor out a 4 from that 24, and that becomes negative 6. I'm basically dividing each term by 4, that GCF. So now I want to factor this term here, or this quadratic here. So I'm saying what multiplies to be negative 6? That adds to be 5. So a big mistake here is people will always go to one without thinking about the signs. And a lot of people will say, oh, 2 and 3. Okay, 2 and 3 multiplied to be 6 had to be 5. That's good. I'm good. Put them in parentheses. I'm done. Wait a second, because you have to pay attention to the signs. Because this is a negative, I need to have one positive, one negative. So with negative 2 and positive 3, they do not combine to be 5. So you need to pay attention to the signs. Because they multiply to be a negative, one's positive, one's negative, I'm finding the difference between the two need to be 5. So what else multiplies to be 6? And a lot of people will always forget about 1 and itself. You always think 2 and 3, that's the only thing that multiplies to be 6. But remember that 6 and 1 also multiply to be 6. And their difference is 5. So which one's going to be positive, which one's going to be negative? And that's your next step. Well, because this is a positive 5, I want the larger number to be positive. So this is going to be a negative 1, positive 6, and that will combine to be positive 5. So then I can go and put it in parentheses, x plus 6, x minus 1. This is not the factored form of my original though, because I got to remember my GCF that I factored out, and I put that here. Now that's the factored form. Okay, so I got another one now, and these are the ones that are a little more difficult. When a is not equal to 1, you still check to see if a GCF can be factored out, but because I can't factor out any factor of the a, then there's no GCF. I can't factor out a 3 from 10 or 13, so I have to use these steps. Now, if you have a different method, that's fine. Copy this down for right now, and then you can show me your other method later on. There are a lot of different ways to factor, a lot of different methods that teachers use. This is the most common that people should have seen from Algebra 1, which is why I'm showing you this one. So the AC method, you have to make sure you follow all of these steps. And a lot of people only follow a couple and then skip some, and you end up getting it wrong. But the first step is to multiply the A and the C. You're still always checking to factor out a GCF. We already did that. Then multiply the A times C. Now A times C is equal to negative 30. Pay attention to the sign. And I'm trying to figure out what multiplies to be negative 30 that combines to be the middle term, negative 13. So that's my second step. So if I go and list them out, and what a lot of people, again, I get 1 and 30, 2 and 15, 3 and 10. A lot of people, 3 and 10, that's 13. You got to pay attention to sign, and you should be paying attention before you start to list them out, so you know what you're listing. This is a negative 30, so one has to be positive, one has to be negative to multiply to be negative 30, which means when you're combining them, you're finding the difference of the two. If I use 10 and 30 and I make one of them, if I use 10 and 3 and I make one of them a negative, that makes a 7 or negative 7. 4 doesn't go into 5 and 6, and that's it. So which of these have a difference of 13, which is going to be 15 and 2. Now my middle term, my B term, is a negative this time, which means my larger number is going to be negative, and it's going to be negative 15, positive 2. So the mistake here is a lot of people go straight to the parentheses. I can't do that anymore. I got to follow these steps. Rewrite the equation, splitting the B term into the two terms using your multiples in the previous step. So I'm using these two terms. So I'm rewriting the problem, 3x squared. Instead of this negative 13x, I'm going to split that into positive 2x, negative 15x. So understand that this is still the same quadratic. Positive 2, negative 15, they still combine to be negative 13. So if you remember, if you look back at the top when we did the FOIL, this is that second step, that middle step after we distributed and before we combine these two middle terms. So now I can do factor by grouping, and I have the steps here for factor by grouping. Group the first two terms, group the last two terms in parentheses. Now, when this is a negative, that negative needs to go in the parentheses as well. So you should still have an addition between the two parentheses, but that negative's on the term inside of the parentheses. And now you can factor out your GCF. Well, nothing goes into 3 and 2, but for this first group, you will always be able to factor out a x. And so that makes this 3x, that makes this 2. And then here, what goes into negative 15 and 10. So what factors out of this second term, negative 15 and negative 10, is a 5. But if this first term is a negative, factor out the negative with it. And that's going to make this a positive 3x and a positive 2. Now I'm making that positive 2 because I factored out the negative. And what should happen, and this will have to happen if you're using the factor by grouping, is these two parentheses should be the same. So if these two parentheses are the same, then you're on the right track, and now you rewrite the parentheses. So that matching parentheses is one of them, one of your factors. The other factor is what's on the outside of each one. The x minus 5 becomes your other parentheses, and this is the factored form. Okay, so I'll do one more, and then a couple U-tries for you. For this one, check to factor out a GCF. 4 goes into 4 and 8, but not 3. So I can't factor out a 4, I can't factor out a 2. So I have to go from here. So when I'm using the AC method, I multiply A times C, which is 4 times 3. That's going to be 12. And they need to combine to be 8. Now, pay attention to your signs. It's a positive 12, which means the signs are going to be the same, because the only way to multiply to get a positive is 2 positives or 2 negatives. And which sign they both will be comes from that B term. So in this case, they're both going to be positive. So I have 1 times 12, 2 times 6, 3 times 4. Which two combine to be 8 is 2 and 6. So now I can go to do my steps. I replace that 8x with 6x plus 2x, the two numbers that I found. And now I can do my factor by grouping. I group the first two, I group the second two. Okay, factor out my GCF. Well, what can factor out here? Not just an x, but also a 2 this time. So I have 2x, that's going to make this 2x and this 3. Now if I distribute this back, it should come back to what's here. And then what can I factor out here? Well, nothing. I can't factor out an x, I can't factor out a 2, I can't factor out a 3. If you can't factor anything out, I still want you to write a 1. Without doing that, you will make mistakes. So if nothing can be factored out, you're factoring out a 1, which doesn't change what's on the inside. And what do we notice? Look at these two. They're the same, which they should be. And now I can go to my factored form. That parentheses is going to be one of the factors. My other factor comes from what's being multiplied to each, 2x plus 1. And that's the reason why I want you to write that 1 there, because without that, people won't see that it's a 1 and you'll just put 2x and you won't put anything here. But it really is a 1. And this is my factored form. Okay, so here are some U-try problems. Remember, always factor out a GCF. In this first one, you can factor out a GCF. This one, you cannot. I'll give you a little bit to try on your own, and then I'll give you the answers. Okay, got a joke for you. What's a sea monster's favorite snack? Chips and dip. Oh! All right, if you want the answers to these, this is the factored form. Okay, so these are the answers, the factored form of each. If you want, I'll go ahead and work each of these out. If you got them right, great job. So if you want, I'll go over the U-tries in a second, but understand, follow all the steps. If you want to try a different method, I use this first because this is what most people did in Algebra 1. So if you're familiar with it and you were good at it and you want to continue doing that, great. It's something you're familiar with, keep going. If you weren't very good with it and you want a different method, a method that I've had a lot of success with is called the T-chart. And I'm going to upload notes for the T-chart. They're a little bit different format because I'm just uploading the ones from last year. But if you want to take a look at that and take the notes for that as well, and then you can decide which one to use, go for it. Okay, you only need to do one of them. You don't have to do this. You don't have to do that. If you have another method, let me know. And because there are other things that you can do if you remember it. Even if you get me started, I can help you out. If you were good with it and you need a refresher, I know a lot of the different methods. I can help you out with that. But if you want one that I found that's been pretty good, you can take those notes and we can discuss it more on next week. Like I said, check for the GCF, factor out a 2. I get x squared minus 4x minus 21. And I'm trying to find what multiplies to be negative 21 that adds to be negative 4. So what multiplies to be negative 21? Because it's a negative, one's positive and one's negative. If I list them all out, well, that's going to be 20. And pay attention here because one's positive and one's negative. And because this middle term is negative, it means the larger of the two is going to be negative. So that's going to be negative 20. If I have 2 doesn't go into 21, 3 and negative 4. I'm sorry, 3 and negative 7. And that does combine to be negative 4. I was looking ahead. So these are my two. And because the A is a 1, I can go straight to my parentheses, x plus 3 times x minus 7. And here, I have to use the AC method. So what multiplies to be A times C, which is going to be 42. And that's a positive 42 that combined to be negative 23. And just start listing them out. 1 and 42. Don't forget about 1 in itself. 2 and 21. 3 and 14. 4 doesn't go into it. 5 doesn't go into it. 6 doesn't go into it. 7, oh, 6 does. 6 and 7. Now, because The AC term is a positive. The middle term is a negative. What that means is both of these terms are going to be negative, because they both have to be the same, but they combine to be a negative, so they both have to be a negative. And which ones combine to be negative 23? Which is going to be these two. So I have 3x squared minus 2x minus, I'm going to put plus negative 21x plus 14. I group, and I'm going to factor out an x here. I'm left with 3x minus 2. I'm going to factor out a negative here. And what goes in 21 and 14 is 7. And that's going to become positive 3x. This becomes a negative 2. If I distribute back, that's negative 21x, negative 14, or I'm sorry, positive 14, which is what it should be. Notice that these two are the same, which they should be. So I have 3x minus 2 times x minus 7.